morning. You just watched our debate live on WPRI 12, and we're joining you now from UMass Dartmouth. This is where the debate tonight was supposed to take place, but of course we know COVID-19 had other plans, so it took place in our WPRI studios. And tonight I'm joined by UMass Dartmouth political science professor Shannon Jenkins just to break down what exactly we just watched live on WPRI 12. Just to start, let's talk about your initial takeaways from the debate.
You know, I think both of the candidates displayed a lot of emotion tonight. We saw a good deal of, I think, anger and fire from Ed Markey. There's definitely times when Joe Kennedy got emotional talking about issues of race and racial injustice. And so both of the candidates felt really passionate. It was hard to see whether that communicated that loss of audience, I think. Sometimes those seem less authentic, right, when there's not an audience there. And so I think that was a challenge for both of the candidates. I think both of the candidates faced some tough questions, and they stumbled a little bit on some of them. I think Representative Kennedy maybe still hasn't quite figured out his answer to why voters should vote for him, and I think Senator Markey maybe floundered a bit on questions about campaign finance. So all in all, I don't think, you know, oftentimes we like to talk about winners and losers. Yeah. After watching it, it wasn't necessarily clear to me that there was a clear winner between the two candidates.
One of the things that you had talked about right off the bat, and Congressman Kennedy referenced it several times throughout the debate. He kept saying he continues to travel across the country to spread the progressive message. And one of the things that you had questioned right off the bat was, does that help with voters in Massachusetts? Will that help them when they go to the polls to make their decision?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an odd line of sort of argument, and especially because, you know, the tagline of Marilyn Markey, like he's been trying to say that Senator Markey is not spending enough time in Massachusetts, he's not a Massachusetts senator, but then in the next sentence he said, you know, he's saying, but I'm going all over the country and visiting all of these other places. And so I'm not really sort of clear where he's going with those two lines of attack when you see them side by side. Yeah. And I do, in a certain sense, then think that that second argument about traveling does in some ways undermine the first argument that Markey needs to be more present in Massachusetts. So I don't know that it's going to help him, because I think those arguments maybe sort of balance out against each other.
I think obviously the topic of age came up throughout the debate, and experience as well. Markey had said at one point, leadership requires bipartisanship, and he was talking about the Green New Deal. He was talking about several bills that he's worked to get passed. But at the same time, he said that Kennedy hasn't gotten any of his own bills passed. Does that matter to a voter?
You know, I think it matters somewhat in a primary, right? In a certain sense, in a general election, you have party labels for voters to help differentiate between the two candidates. And I think we saw this, we talked about in the rapid fire, that the two candidates literally agreed on every single issue. And so it's very hard to find policy differences between the candidates. I think at one point, it devolved into a debate of who trusted Trump last, right? Yes. And so they're arguing who's more committed to the same position, that perhaps then accomplishments can matter, because how else are you going to differentiate between these two candidates right now? And that, I think, is a little bit of a struggle for the Kennedy campaign. I do know that there are a lot of people, and we talked about this in the context of campaign finance, that, you know, Congressman Kennedy went after Senator Markey for accepting donations from non-progressive donors. And he said, well, why didn't you give that money to other races where it might be needed more? And I can see Democratic primary voters saying, well, he wouldn't need to do that if you weren't primarying him. So, you know, he hasn't really sort of given very much for voters to hang their hat on in terms of real policy differences. And so I do think those accomplishments might matter to voters.
You know, another thing that they agreed on was the question that was actually posed by the chancellor here at UMass Dartmouth. How do you support college students? Obviously, graduating from college is a huge accomplishment, but with that, for many kids across the country, comes with the burden of student debt. And both Markey and Kennedy agreed on this issue too, and they said they want to help to rid student debt. I believe Markey said forgive $10,000 off student debt. Kennedy said wipe out student debt for 95% of borrowers. How exactly do you differentiate yourself on that topic too. Were you surprised to hear them agree so much on that?
Yeah, you know, I think in a certain sense, though, too, one of the things that Markey was trying to do in that issue that I thought was somewhat effective is to establish himself as a relatable person. I'm not sure watching the whole debate, either of them comes off as sort of relatable to the average voter. But on that issue, you know, and they were introduced with where their degrees are from. Now they both went to prestigious private institutions. But with Markey saying, you know, I had to pay for college, and I think that was a really calculated way of presenting an answer to that question, to differentiate himself, you know, without saying I wasn't a Kennedy.
Yeah.
So there are, I think, subtle ways that they're trying within the confines of agreement to differentiate themselves. Whether voters pick up on that or whether it resonates with them, I think is a big unknown question right now.
Do you think Congressman Kennedy, being a Kennedy, works against him?
I think not. For some voters, I think it works for him. And this is, you know, as I've been following this race and talking to other people about it, it's a weird sort of inversion of the age issue. Typically in a race where you see a younger candidate challenging an older incumbent, young voters will support the younger candidate and older voters support the older candidate. But we seem to have an inversion of that here, right? It seems to be that a lot of older voters and more maybe regular entrenched Democrats, right, really remember the Kennedy name with sort of a nostalgia, and so they are more supportive of Kennedy. On the flip side, because of Senator Markey's, you know, work with Ocasio-Cortez on the Green New Deal, which I think he mentioned about, I don't know, 50 times tonight, you see a lot of younger voters supporting him. And so I think with younger voters, I think the Kennedy name doesn't really matter that much. I do think it might help him with some potentially older voters, to the extent that, you know, how is turnout going to look in the next election is going to be really hard to predict, right? Normally, older people are more reliable voters. On the other hand, we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? Are older voters going to feel comfortable going out if we don't get sort of more mail-in and absentee ballot provisions out there? I don't know. So I don't think it's going to hurt him.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I think it is helping him as much as he thought it would when he entered the race.
Let's talk about the tone of both candidates tonight, and you had touched on it before. Senator Markey was very proud in the beginning. He was very confident, and he started to raise his voice a little bit very early on, I'd say within the first 5 to 10 minutes. And then you had Congressman Kennedy, and I believe it was when the question was posed, how do you allow these protests to continue to go on when people can't go to funerals right now because of COVID-19? And he got emotional talking about the fact that he had missed out on a funeral for someone that he cared about. Do you think that those tones work tonight? Do you think that that plays to a voter, the emotion and then also how worked up Senator Markey got so early on?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it was really interesting how worked up and how right out of the gate that Senator Markey came out pretty, he was almost angry, right?
Yeah.
We might say he was angry. And I think he came back around to that again towards the end of the debate. I don't know, right? I think sometimes in person that sort of anger and passion can play out more authentically. I think it might be a little bit more difficult to not come off as just angry, yelling, you know, like get off my lawn sort of anger. That might be more difficult to avoid when you're not person to person. But on the flip side, I also think the emotion that Joe Kennedy felt, I don't doubt that it's authentic, but I'm not sure that it came across as very authentic either on TV. And then again, I think that's just the difficulty, another challenge, right? In the age of COVID-19, how do you authentically connect with voters when you can't?
Absolutely.
You know, we talked about the president earlier tonight. The president announced he's going to be starting major, right, rallies in person in 2 weeks, right? I don't think either of these candidates is going to be doing that. So how do you connect with voters? Because emotional connections to voters are important in shaping their votes. I think a lot of times, particularly in a primary, again, when you don't have partisan labels to differentiate voters, there's your gut, right? Who do you feel in your gut? And that's about emotional connections, which are so much harder to make when you can't be in person with people.
You being an expert, how do you make yourself as a candidate more relatable over the next few months? And how do you get someone at home who's maybe on the fence at this point to say, that's my guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that particularly Senator Markey was trying to do is to connect himself to other people that voters feel emotional connections to. And so we talked about the number of times he dropped Senator Bernie Sanders' names, the number of times he dropped Representative Ocasio-Cortez's name, Senator Harris's name was mentioned a lot. I think Senator Markey was trying to build these affective, emotional connections by connecting himself deeply to other candidates that voters, Democratic primary voters, feel strongly about. Joe Kennedy didn't do that quite as much. We didn't hear him drop sort of those names. I mean, in part, I think Senator Markey has an advantage here of being a senator. Senators are visible. So the people that you're often working with are more recognizable names. Kennedy doesn't have quite that luxury. People don't know many members of the House of Representatives. And so that's harder, and that may be a challenge for him in how to establish those emotional connections.
Obviously, this debate taking place tonight was supposed to take place here tonight along the south coast of Massachusetts. One of the questions they were asked was about New Bedford and changing the NOAA headquarters and putting them in New Bedford. And obviously, you know, NOAA has ranked New Bedford's port as one of the most valuable ports in the country for decades at this point. It seemed as if both candidates, they committed that they wanted to entertain moving NOAA headquarters, but they didn't necessarily commit to that. Is that the sense that you got?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very tricky question, right? Because, you know, I think in a certain sense, where I think it's out on the Cape now. So if you move it from the Cape, right, you make people in New Bedford happy, but people on then the Cape is part of Massachusetts, right? And so I think they were both a little bit, it was a really wonky sort of deep South Coast question. But at the same point in time, I think that both candidates were trying to walk that delicate balance a little bit, right, to, you know, say that's a good idea, but we have to see. I do think that a little bit played to Congressman Kennedy's strengths, right? He represents the region. I mean, Senator Markey does, but he also represents the rest of the state. Representative Kennedy, has been down to a number of the sort of the blue economy events we've had down here in the South Coast. And I think that he was able to display that knowledge on that question, and that was a real sort of pitch to you know, the South Coast voters. But I do think this is interesting. We were talking about the South Coast tends to be what we might say is a purple region, right? It's not a very, very reliably blue region. At the same point in time, right, both candidates were touting how progressive they are and how liberal they are, which suggests to me that they were not just pitching their debate responses to the South Coast. They were really thinking about the whole state and Democratic primary voters.
Absolutely. You know, right now it's hard to believe that we're going to have an election so soon with everything that's going on. We have a public health crisis, and now we have civil unrest. And both of those issues were touched on tonight in one of the questions when they asked about is it okay for people to go to protests when there are funerals that can't happen right now? And that's a tough question because I think there's a delicate balance between public health and also your civil responsibility for both of these candidates. Right. Do you think that they handled that question the right way?
I mean, I think they both spoke to what they believed, which was that they are in support of these protests. And you know, it is very difficult, but I think Senator Markey tried to point out, right, that people are trying to social distance. Oftentimes you see pictures of protesters wearing masks. You know, earlier protests about the reopening of the economy, people were not wearing masks. They were not trying to social distance. Representative Kennedy, I think, went a little bit more personal, right? You talked about how he talked about his personal sort of conflicts, but again, ultimately they came down in the same position on that, right? Yes, it is difficult, but the protests are necessary. And so again, it was another example of an issue that you really couldn't drive much of a wedge between the two of them on that issue.
One of the questions was about supporting temporary unemployment benefits for undocumented immigrants, and both candidates said yes, they would like to do that. And Kennedy went as far as saying he would actually want that to apply outside of the pandemic. Do you think that plays okay to voters here in the South Coast of Massachusetts?
So I've been thinking a lot today, and I've seen political scientists talking about the concept of what we call an Overton window.
Okay.
And it's the idea that in any political system on any issue, there is a range of potential solutions, but oftentimes issues outside of this window are not acceptable. And I think what we're really seeing, particularly in the Democratic Party, but even more generally, is the Overton window is sliding towards the left.
Yeah.
Right? When the 2012 Republican presidential nominee marches and tweets that Black Lives Matter, right? I think that was pretty unthinkable for a lot of people, that Mitt Romney would be saying that when he ran for president in 2012. And so I think both of the candidates have realized that things are shifting left, particularly in the Democratic primary. Mm-hmm. And I think this is very evident on the question of undocumented immigrants. This is something where in the past candidates might have, hemmed and hawed and tried to, but both of them were unequivocal a yes about during the pandemic, and Kennedy went, even further, committing to, beyond that. I don't think they followed up. Markey didn't say that one way or the other, and there wasn't a follow-up because it got lost a little bit in the details of whether the $2,000 did this or that, and so it veered off a little. So I can't say where Markey would stand on that issue, but it just shows to me that the Democratic primary, that electorate, they seem to believe has shifted very far left. Because again, they were both in very similar places on that.
And it's very interesting too, because as you said, Markey at that point, when it was the discussion of whether those benefits should apply outside of the pandemic, he just started talking about the legislation that he's been working on, but never actually definitively said that he would be okay.
Yeah,
with
and
that.
I think that he mentioned Bernie Sanders like 4 or 5 times, and that was fine. Again, there wasn't a straight, but it was again establishing those progressive credentials.
And Bernie Sanders, you and I were both saying on Twitter, as you're scrolling through to see how people are reacting, there were many Bernie supporters who were saying that they supported Markey and that they were proud of the way he was performing tonight. So maybe he had the right idea with throwing out a name like Sanders?
Right. I mean, I do think there is a good bit of overlap between Sanders supporters and Markey supporters. It's not perfect. I mean, some Sanders supporters will support Kennedy, but I do think you see that, and I think the Markey campaign hired some former Sanders staffers when he closed his campaign down. Mm-hmm. So they are really trying to reach out to that group, both through their connection to Sanders and also to Ocasio-Cortez.
We were talking tonight about how both candidates are trying to, it seemed like they weren't just trying to reach voters here in South Coast Massachusetts. They were trying to reach voters throughout the state of Massachusetts. But here along southeastern Massachusetts, polls have shown that this could be a key battleground area for these candidates. What do they need to do moving forward to show that they are the right candidate for voters in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways Kennedy has a little bit of a home field advantage down here. Mm-hmm. He represents Fall River as part of his district, right, and parts of the South Coast, and WPR's television viewership. So I think he has some familiarity with the issues around here, talking about the blue economy. I do think that a lot of voters, if you look at polls, are undecided now. Yeah. And that makes it really hard as sort of a political scientist to say what are voters gonna decide on. As a political scientist normally say, well, the incumbent really has an advantage here, and it's up to the challenger to tell voters why they shouldn't vote for the incumbent. But in this race, right, that was flipped on its head, mm-hmm. right? Kennedy, when he entered the race, had a wide lead according to polls that Markey, by most accounts now, has sort of closed. It's a dead heat. So I'm not really sure, to be honest with you, how that is going to play out, right? Do we end up over the next few months in a more conventional race where Markey has more of a incumbent advantage as people start to decide and they don't see reasons to knock the incumbent out. That may be part of it, and that may be why Markey, I think, spends a lot of time talking about his record. You know, again, in this region, though, that may not be enough. I don't know, right, that natural sort of advantage, because Kennedy hasn't just been, right, in Fall River. No. He attends, we talked about a lot of events here on campus, right? He's a known presence down here, and so that may be helpful for Kennedy as well.
If you're a voter watching tonight, in your opinion, was there anything that either candidate said or did that might make you change your mind, if maybe you kind of had your mindset as to who you would choose?
I don't really think that either candidate won or had a knockout punch tonight, although sometimes it's hard to tell when you're, you know, it was just us watching, yeah. So it's hard to sometimes gauge reactions. As you said, we were both kind of scrolling through Twitter to see, but I mean, let's be honest, Twitter is not really a representative sample of the average voter. I think debates are very important in getting people's positions out there, getting voters. I don't know, though, if tonight's debate gave voters maybe fewer, it might have reinforced, right? We know that sort of information tends to reinforce if you've already made decisions. Mm-hmm. But for voters who haven't made a decision, I don't know if tonight convince them, but I'm not really sure what will convince them, to be honest with you. Yeah.
So at this point, you wouldn't say that either of them did a little bit better than the other?
I didn't see it. I didn't really see it. Maybe you come back and you can email me and you can I'll tell you in a couple of days. Yeah. But I mean, personally, I saw some wins on both sides. I saw maybe some missteps on both sides. And I don't think anyone clearly had sort of the knockout punch tonight.
And as you've said, it is so hard to judge a debate when a debate is in COVID-19 time, right, when we do not have a live audience and you don't have the reaction.
Right, right.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about tonight? Any other takeaways or highlights you think are worth noting?
You know, I mean, I really do think the biggest surprise for me really was how much, you know, my notes, I said that Markey really came out swinging. Mm-hmm. And I think I haven't seen that quite as much, you know, in recent, but he's really, I think, decided that he really needs to attack a little bit. Yeah. Not personally, right, but really sort of really about this line that I think that he's got the track record, because I think potentially maybe he's decided that's Kennedy's weakness, that there is not that there's not a good, clear reason. So I think that was the biggest highlight for me, or the biggest takeaway, that this is clearly seems to be where the Markey campaign is going to go.
He thinks that this is a very intense race.
Yeah. Right. And I think Kennedy has figured that out by now. Yeah. I don't think he thought that was going to be the case when he entered the race. I think he made a strategic calculation that this was going to be the easiest seat for him to pick up. Mm-hmm. That if there are future seats, there are other qualified incumbents like Maura Healey, Ayanna Pressley, lots of others who might run for a seat like that. And so he made a calculation that, you know, the polls showed him up, he was going to jump in. And I think it's been a lot harder race than he thought it might be, Kennedy. And I think tonight really, Markey really showed he's not going to roll over and let this seat go without a fight.
And I think tonight showed that the next couple of months are going to be very interesting.
Yeah, in this race. Very important.
Very, very important. Yeah. Professor Shannon Jenkins, a political science professor here at UMass Dartmouth. Again, the debate tonight was supposed to take place at UMass Dartmouth, but we are living in an era of COVID-19. Much more post-debate coverage coming up tonight on Eyewitness News at 10 on Fox Providence and 11 o'clock on WKRI 12. Thank you for joining us.